At UCI, we believe in the infinitely curious. We believe in the courageous of thought, the ones willing to fail again and again, until one day they don't. When you have the courage to see things differently, to see opportunity where others see impossibility, amazing things will happen. At UCI, we stop at nothing to change the world, to save lives and deliver the extraordinary.
Hello and thank you for joining us today. I'm Paul Stover, President of the OSI Forum, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to providing a civil public space focused on events that impact our community. Our goal is to facilitate extraordinary programs with visionaries, connections, conversations, and solutions. On behalf of the entire OSI Forum Board, we'd like to thank you for joining us for the Future of virtual program series made possible by presenting sponsors UCI and UCI Health.
Fantastic.
With the support of all our generous sponsors and viewers like you, the OSI Forum has been able to provide great virtual conversations with completely open access to the entire community. If you are able, we would appreciate your donation or membership so that we may continue to provide these timely programs. We look forward to your continued partnership as we celebrate the OSI Forum's 30th anniversary throughout the year. Because without your support, our public service programming simply would not be possible. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy today's program. And don't forget to have a great OSI Day.
Welcome to another virtual OSI Forum event. Today we bring you the Future of the Economy, Part 2, with Dr. Mira Farka, an economist with the Wood Center at Cal State Fullerton. After her presentation, we'll have a Q&A session with OSI Forum President Paul Stover and Dr. Farka. You can submit your questions in the comments section of the YouTube live channel. Now, please welcome Dr. Mira Farka.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me over. It's a real pleasure and honor to be part of the OSI Forum series about the future. First and foremost, I hope you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Second, I want to say I am particularly excited about being here today, getting out of Zoom and into this wonderful studio, dealing with a wonderful production crew here who have been absolutely amazing. So I'm really excited. I'm wearing proper shoes. You guys can't see it, but I'm really excited about it. It's a victory. So with that, let me actually start going with the forecast. First and foremost, let me start, while I'm getting the PowerPoint set up here, let me start by saying, please don't shoot the messenger. Some of the data and the models we'll actually share with you today are a bit disturbing, a bit kind of paint a dark picture, especially in the short run. So please, that's my plea to you. And you've heard about a Great Depression, you've heard about the Great Recession. We're calling this the Great Disruption. And yes, life is like a box of chocolate. You never know what you're going to get. Unfortunately, recently, we sort of got a kind of somewhat poisonous and a bitter chocolate that will probably leave kind of a lingering bad taste in our mouth for quite a while, unfortunately. And that's what we're worried about. And of course, this is because first and foremost, we're dealing with a virus. This is sort of a ticking and relentless sort of time bomb. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this graphic here. This is Johns Hopkins dashboard that basically catalogs the cases and deaths all over the world. The US has about 1.7 million cases. We passed a grim milestone yesterday, 100,000 deaths. These are absolutely horrifying numbers. And of course, what this led to an unprecedented shutdown around the world in order to stop the spread of the virus. Of course, this has led to a global recession. Now, speaking of the recession, if there's a small silver lining about this whole thing that I as an economist can take out of this is that, for once, we as economists are not to blame. This is not something we failed to see or we could have foreseen and we miss. This is first and foremost a public health crisis, not an economic crisis. Unfortunately, it is turning into one, but in a sense, we're not to blame. We kind of wash our hands off of this one for now. Now, of course, these unprecedented shutdowns have come into effect because of these epidemiological models that sort of initially forecasted this catastrophic number of deaths. It started with the Imperial College of London that basically forecasted 2.2 million deaths in the US. I mean, this was in mid-March, and that led to unprecedented shutdowns. Now, of course, there were other models. The Institute for Health Metric Evaluation initially had 81,000 deaths, and then they've gone through a rounds of revision. Then they scaled it back to 60, then early May at 135, and now they're settled around 140,000 deaths or so. If you look at the MIT model, initially in early March, they predicted about 40,000 deaths. Now they're about 200,000 deaths or so. So again, these numbers are absolutely horrific, but these are prediction models, and predictions are very difficult. I mean, prediction business is a very tough business. I know it because I'm in one. In fact, this kind of reminds me of Ken Arrow, a famous economist who he was actually developing forecasting models, weather forecast models for World War II when he served in World War II. And he figured out after a while that the forecast models were no good. Basically, they were kind of useless, completely useless actually. So he went to his commanding officers asking the commanding officers for him not to continue to produce these forecasts, which are pretty much sort of worthless. And the answer he got back was, the commanding general is well aware that the forecasts are no good. However, he needs them for planning purposes. So we actually need this we actually use these forecast models, this sort of prediction models, for planning purposes. And look, having worked with forecast models all my life, I'm deeply sympathetic to all modelers out there. It's a very humbling experience. It's actually an exercise in humility, if you will. But in a sense, I feel some of this humility was kind of missing a little bit when we ran with these models and used them to shut down the entire globe. And of course, you know what happened. There's no doubt that you know the consequences, right? There's no doubt we are in a recession. The question is, how deep and how long, right? And when we talk about recession, so how black is this swan? Now, when we talk about recessions, we normally talk about three factors. We talk about the depth, we talk about the dispersion or the breadth, and we talk about duration. So, in a sense, the 3 Ds, right? And we do think that this recession will be short, but a very bitter and nasty one. And that's because the pandemic is hitting both the supply and the demand sides of the market. And if you look, for example, at supply side alone, of course, we shut down entire businesses. If you look at percentage of small businesses closed throughout the U.S., I mean, more than 90% of beauty and personal care, more than 90% of leisure and entertainment is closed down. Food and drinks, more than 80% closed. And the rest, and the slew of other small businesses are particularly hurting and closed. Of course, this has huge negative ramification for revenues. Revenues have completely collapsed. If you look at lodging, down 86%, bars and lounges and restaurants, 57, 60%, and so on. Now, not all businesses are doing bad. Of course, as you'd expect, grocery store revenues are up. And lo and behold, gun sales are up. I mean, actually, they're going off the roof. Now, if we look back, a step back, and we look at the entire shutdown, we think that during the period, our calculations show that during the couple of months that we've been closed down, the share of GDP loss was roughly about 32%. And if you want to translate into the dollar amount, that actually translates to about almost $600 billion per month. So it's quite a hefty amount that we lost per month. Now, what started as a supply side shock has morphed, unfortunately, into a demand side shock. In fact, the labor market has been completely decimated. I mean, these are numbers for unemployment claims. Of course, they were very low, about 225,000 a month, up until mid-March, and then you see a huge increase. In fact, since the middle of March, we lost about 40.7 million jobs, or almost 41 million jobs. And of course, this was only in 10 weeks, 2.5 months that this has been going on. If you look at the labor market data, labor force has completely dropped by about 8 million. It's now back to where it was in the levels that we saw in 2013, but employment has seen even a much bigger drop. And this is back to where it was back in 1999. So we literally have lost 2 decades here in terms of employment. And the bad news is that this data doesn't capture everything. The survey ends in mid-April, and since then we've actually lost more jobs. So we do expect the next survey that comes out next week, next Friday, will show much worse numbers than here. Now, of course, whether your job was at risk or not depend on this new category of defining work, which is essential work. And you know your essential workers. You got your healthcare workers, your police, your grocery store, the delivery people. There's a couple of other categories. Government is deemed itself 100% essential. Marijuana stores happen to be essential, but of course, given that we're all shut down, I'll be the last person to gripe with that. Now, of course, who are your non-essential employees? Well, here it is, your very own, yours truly, very proud non-essential employee. I made peace with that a long time ago, so I'm fine, as the case may be. Now, we did this analysis at the beginning of this pandemic to see how many jobs were at risk. And in a sense, it depends on whether your job is classified as essential, but also whether you could actually work remotely. So we did this national sort of analysis, and we saw that about 58% of employees are kind of deemed essential. That translates to about 88 million people. So these jobs, let's assume all of these jobs are safe for now, right? And then non-essential workers are about 42%, 64 million. Of the non-essential workers, though, about 30% have the ability to work remotely. That's about 19 million people, which basically left about 45 million people at risk of losing their jobs. So we were actually quite close. We already lost 41 million jobs right now, right? So we're actually close on the mark for this. Now, because the sectoral breakdown of the market is very much behind, remember the survey data only goes as far as mid-April. If you look at it from sectoral perspective, we think we're going to have a few more job losses that will show up in next week's report. And if you look at it by sector, we think leisure and hospitality has already lost 8.2 million jobs. But our calculation think that there's another 4.5 million jobs are at risk for a total of 12.5 million jobs in this sector alone. Professional services lost 2.2 million, but given that another 6 million is at risk, that gives us to about 8.2 million that potentially could lose jobs from this sector. Same goes with retail. 2.5 million jobs have been lost. Another 5 million are at risk, right? And here is a breakdown of the rest of sectoral categories. Now, if you look at this from a more local perspective, we think that in LA area, for example, there's about 1.13 million jobs at risk. In Orange County, that's about 420,000. And in Inland Empire, about 520,000 jobs that are still at risk. Some of them have already lost a job, but again, the numbers don't bear it out, as I'll talk about it a little bit later. Now, so of course this, and I think my slides are having a bit of a problem, but the question is, how long will this last, right? So this is actually, the duration is key. How long will this recession go? Well, the problem is that, so the longer this goes on, the longer the economy remains not fully open, obviously this will create more problem. It will be more painful. So if you, as Dr. Fauci said, who seems to live in my television set every night, especially during during the last couple of months, you don't make the timeline, the virus makes the timeline. Now, there's no doubt that a lot of states are opening up, and that's actually good news. However, we do expect, and excuse me a second, let me get the next, hopefully the backup would work a little better for me to advance my slides here. But a lot of states are actually opening right now. Of course, we are assuming that a lot of these guidelines about reopening will stay in place for quite a while. Social distancing, restriction of large gathering, which again, this will make this a very difficult sort of a recovery moving forward. Now, in terms of the virus, this also doesn't work. I mean, oh, here we go. It is, I'm getting a hang of it. Talking about economists, how many does it take to screw up a light bulb? Move up the slides, right? The virus timeline is also something that we actually make some assumptions about. We're assuming there are going to be treatment drugs by late summer, targeted antibodies by fall, a vaccine not available probably until mid-2021 or so. Now, this is one of the, so the duration of this is a bit iffy and we still don't know about it, right? So this is one of the big sort of assumptions that we have to make to come up with our projections. However, another very big key, another important sort of plank, if you will, or factor into how this recovery will unfold is the policy response. And the policy response has been absolutely bonkers here. It's been unprecedented, swift, bold. The Fed has literally gone nuclear. They've done whatever it takes to keep the economy afloat. I mean, they actually took over, they sort of dusted off some old policies from the previous financial crisis. They did the usual stuff, the rate cutting and the forward guidance and quantitative easing, open-ended quantitative easing. But they've done far, far more than that. I mean, if you look at this, they've actually now gone in the business of lending directly to banks, to banks, to firms. You see the Main Street lending, it's about $600 billion. This is about mid-sized companies. They're also supporting the SBA program, the PPP program for small businesses. They've also thrown a bunch of money, $750 billion, to unclog the corporate bond market. They're also doing municipal lending to cities and other municipalities, up to $500 billion and so on. So certainly the policy response has been completely unprecedented. Now, fiscal side, same thing. You see guns blazing here. We've had a couple of sort of phases of fiscal support. The phase one was about $8.3 billion. This is mostly about the virus, sort of research into the vaccine and the virus itself. Phase two, another smallish $180 billion. This was mostly about Medicare and to support sick leave. Phase three was the big one, $2.3 trillion with money for everybody in it, right? And then we even saw a phase 3.5, that we call it, a bit of a replenishment for $480 billion. And this was a replenishment of the PPP program as well as support for hospitals that came into this bill. Now, if you want to look at this by categories, so overall small businesses have gotten roughly about $730 billion of support. If you look at individuals, the support for individuals has been about $656 billion. That includes unemployment benefits and direct checks that most individuals got. If you look at large corporations, the support there had been $510 billion. Healthcare has gotten some $340 billion. Small business tax got another $280. States and municipalities have gotten about $150 billion and so on, and the rest of the categories are there. So the response have been absolutely guns blazing, and this is good because it will actually help us into the recovery. In fact, you can argue it's a little bit too much at this stage. Although, because the recovery, as we'll lay out here, will be a little more tepid, more may actually be needed. Now, if you look at it in comparison, this was about 6% of GDP. The fiscal support amounted 6% of GDP back in 08, 09, and now it's almost 14% of GDP. So you can see the differences between the two. Now, I mentioned the PPP support because this has been very important for small businesses, and it's actually been quite important for them to stay afloat. Now, if you look at approved PPP loans as percent of small business payrolls, on average nationally, that comes to about 20%. But there is cross variation across states. So some states got more than 20%. So if you look at the states here that have more than 20%, these are mostly the South as well as the Great Plains as well. And you've got the rest of the state who got between 18 and 20%. So this is pretty much the Midwest and a lot of the rest of the states. However, there's some states, mostly the East Coast and the West Coast, who got less than basically their percent is less than 18% of the percent of PPP loans as a fraction of overall small business loans. For small business payrolls is less than 18%. California is one of those states that is getting less. We're getting about PPP covers about 17% of annual payroll of small businesses in California, which is less than the 20% in the national average. Now, of course, thankfully, states are reopening. We're moving towards April and May are behind us. Those are the worst months of this recession, and we're looking forward to a recovery. So if you look at it in terms of the number of states reopening, 34 states have reopened already. There's about 13 other states that are doing some kind of regional reopening. California is one of them. This is a bit more partial because some areas are still closed down. And there's only really 3 states left that are still under shutdown orders, but we expect them to actually open up soon now. Now, how is this reopening sort of working out? I mean, it's important to see that life is seeping back in. Vestiges of life are actually appearing everywhere, right? For example, we look at restaurant dining activity. This is from Open Table Reservations. And notice that Naples, for example, and Tampa, Florida eased restrictions on seated dinings early on. I mean, you see that has picked up quite a bit from negative 100% to now being negative 30%. Same goes with Houston and so on. So life is coming back to most of the cities that are reopening. Another thing we're keeping a close eye on are these Google mobility data. And for this, but what this does, this tracks Google mobility by looking at the at activity on the cell phone. And of course, if you look at people are venturing out into parks, which is fantastic, but also if you take a look at it in the next graph, the retail and recreation are also sort of coming back up, right? So life is coming back in. A few more encouraging signs. If you look at new business filings with IRS, they have moved up from negative 40%, practically very little, to about negative 20, so it's moved up now. That means this is good news. That means more small businesses are opening up, or at least they're filing to open up, so this is certainly encouraging news. And another thing we're keeping an eye on are actually credit card and debit card transactions. So notice here that actually that has moved up as well. And these are not, this exclude the online transaction. This is transactions with debit and credit cards when the card is actually present. So these are all great news. Now, as we keep moving on to further stages of reopening, right, it's important to kind of keep and take a look at how what the shape of this recovery will be. We can kind of look a little bit towards China because they're kind of a couple of months ahead of us in this whole pandemic, right? So if we look at data from China, these are preliminary data. If we look at production activity, for example, this is high-frequency data from Goldman Sachs. Well, notice that you see a sharp drop, basically in late January and early February, but then a very quick recovery. So if China production is now back to the levels where it was before the pandemic began over there. However, consumer activity is still sort of low. So if you look at it here, consumer activity seems to be a little bit, so even though it dropped quite a bit, it has improved, but we're still about 25% below normal levels before the pandemic began. So that gives us, so this makes us think that the shape of this recovery, I mean, the recovery will probably be sort of more tepid than we would have liked for. I mean, not everything that we lost during this ice age will be gained back immediately. And there's reasons for this. First of all, there's a couple of reasons. First, the reopening is actually a bit gradual. It's a bit tentative, social distancing in place, different restrictions in different places and large gathering or so on. And second, not everything that we lost, it will be actually come back very quickly. It's impossible to do that. So we do think, take for example, consumption, right? I mean, you have to look, if you look at consumption spending, you have to look all the way back to the 1950s to look double-digit declines. 11% in the 1950s and 1951, these are the recession then. There was another big drop in 1980, about 8.7% drop. But these are completely overshadowed. They're completely dwarfed by the type of decline that we actually are expecting in the second quarter of this year. We're looking for a 30% decline here. And basically, you know, after we hoarded all the toilet paper like Elaine over here, Americans went home, locked their doors, and forgot to spend. Now, don't get me wrong. We do think that the third quarter will be likely the best we've ever seen in record. There's a lot of pent-up demand out there for all sorts of services. That trip to the barber, that trip to the nail salon and the hair salon, or your favorite restaurant that you haven't done. But even so, we don't think their consumption will recover fully, not until late 2021. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, income has taken a huge hit. So if you look at income loss during this period, right, and if you annualize it, and this includes households and small businesses, this comes to about $1.1 trillion in annualized term. Now, if you look at the support that has been thrown into it, the CARES Act threw about $640 billion at the, if you want to count both small businesses and individuals here. And of course, there are some automatic stabilizers like unemployment insurance that kick in, like the fact that you're getting unemployment insurance and you're not paying payroll taxes during the time that you're unemployed. But this still leaves quite a bit of a hole, about a 200 billion hole that needs to be plugged in. And again, part of the reason is because we've had a huge drop in employment. Now, one of the good news of this is that most people seem to think these are temporary layoffs, right? If you look at it historically here, you see that temporary layoffs are roughly about 800,000 to 1 million per month, right? But you know, the very last data, if you look at April, that number shot up to 18 million people. So 18 million people are telling the BLS that they're actually unemployed, but their unemployment is temporary. So it's actually a temporary layoff. Now, this is good news. The problem is that what started as a temporary layoff may unfortunately become a permanent one. And there's a couple of reasons for this, right? And the first, more importantly, this is because this pandemic has hit very hard businesses, both large and small. Take, for example, small businesses. A lot of them have very few cash buffers, right? I mean, the cash buffers, more than half of businesses are telling us that the cash buffers last less than 2 months. Restaurants only have cash buffers for about 20 days. Only 30% of businesses have cash the last 3 to 6 months. So again, it's a tough business to be in. And more importantly, even though the help came in, the help may have been a bit too little and a bit too late. For example, 3.8 million out of 30 million small businesses actually have received PPP, both tranches. And PPP covers only about 20% of payroll, as I mentioned earlier, and lasts only 2 months. And again, if the economy struggles, you will need more money than for 2 months. More importantly, it is kind of difficult to see how this will work out for small businesses to operate a business in a 6-food economy. 25% of businesses are in high contact. It's very hard to run a restaurant with 40% capacity. And this kind of makes us a little worried that some of these small businesses may not survive this and may not be any soup for us in our favorite restaurant, and that's what concerns us. And this matters. This matters because small businesses employ 48% of jobs nationally. The number is even bigger at the local level, about 52% in Orange County. So this matters tremendously. Now, large corporations are also in trouble. In fact, there's a looming debt crisis for large corporations. Corporate debt has skyrocketed to 74% of GDP. And more concerning for us, and this is something we've mentioned for a while now, but more concerning is the quality of this debt. I mean, about $3 trillion of this debt in corporate bond debt is actually A-rated, which is fine. But about $3 trillion is B-rated, which is just a notch above junk. And about $1.3 trillion is actually junk-rated. So, of course, the problem is that, you know, some of these sectors, some of these large corporations may easily see losses in revenues about 50, 60%, which means that this could create problems and could take some of these companies from a liquidity crisis in which they're in into a solvency issue. So again, these are things that make us think that probably this recovery will not be as fast as we had hoped. Now, another factor that we think will kind of hinder a little bit the recovery is also the state fiscal budget. So if you look at state budget, we ran this analysis. So if you look at state budget shortfalls from now until the end of fiscal year 2022. So we think that they will need some funds. So funds that are needed to fight the COVID-19, so fight the crisis, probably comes to about $150 billion. On top of this, though, you have another $450 billion, which is the economic impact on state budget. Again, this is for all 50 states, right? Because of the shutdown. Now, if you look at their resources, so how they can fill these budget holes, right? The CARES Act did appropriate $150 billion for states. And states themselves have some reserves, about 50 billion, 60 billion, this is a bit nebulous, but 50 to 60 billion. But this still leaves about 350 billion shortfall for the 2-year period for states. Now, we do think that there will be some more fiscal support forthcoming. Of course, more targeted and less generous than the previous one. But what does the likely phase 4 stimulus look like? Probably we envision another $150 billion for small business loans for the PPP program. Extended unemployment benefits, another $300 billion will probably go there. And again, these are not the enhanced unemployment benefits without the $600 a week. But certainly we do envision some extended unemployment benefits. And of course, some help to state and local government in the tune of $250 billion. So the total package will likely be about $700 billion. We expect this to pass likely around the end of summer, early fall. So some more support will be, and this would actually help the recovery going forward. Now, what is our outlook for the U.S. economy? Well, is it going to be a V-shape, which is basically you fall quickly, but then you recover quickly? Is it going to be a U-shape, where you kind of linger at the bottom a little bit? Or is it L-shape, which is pretty much a depression? Well, we picked a different letter this time. We think this is going to be a W-shaped recovery. So when we come back, when the economy reopens, this is going to be the third quarter is going to be the fastest on record we've ever seen. But then, you know, sort of this damage that was already done will be hard to kind of solve through and sort out. So we do think that GDP growth will drop by about 5.2% this year, and we'll see another increase by 1.8% next year. Unemployment rate, again, this is for the U.S. economy here, will peak at 17.4% in the second quarter, but then continue to remain high, 6.5% by the end of 2021. If you want to look at the yearly averages, about 10.4% this year and about 6.8% next year. So if you want to look, our predictions also for real estate market is here. We do forecast a little bit of a decline in home prices, probably about 8% nationally. Nothing too earth-shattering, and this is probably going to reach its peak by early next year, but then the home prices will recover soon thereafter. What we do think is going to have a much tougher time, though, is the commercial real estate market, where we do see a decline of about 22% all the way to the middle of next year, and then a more tepid recovery, so that even by the end of 2022, we see a decline of we see the commercial real estate prices still being below where they were prior to COVID-19. Now, very, very quickly, let me turn my attention to the local economy. So, of course, the state and local economies have been particularly hard hit by the crisis. If you look at unemployment numbers, they have skyrocketed. And again, this is not a complete picture. We expect worse data in June. But California, for example, was experiencing one of the lowest unemployment rates on record, 3.9% in February. That has actually skyrocketed to 15.5% now. If you want to compare this with the Great Recession, the highest unemployment we saw back then was 12.3%. Same goes for Orange County. Orange County numbers, so 2.8% before the crisis, shot up to 13.8% now. And the highest unemployment rate during the Great Recession was 10%. So we're already beyond that. Same goes for LA. LA unemployment is really hit particularly hard by this crisis. Unemployment is 20%. The numbers are going to get worse. If you compare it with the recession, it was 13.2% during the Great Recession. And the Inland Empire numbers are here as well. Now, if you want to look a slightly more granular look about labor force changes and employment changes, if we look at California, for example, the latest report, which was released last Friday, shows that we lost 2.5 million jobs. Now, compare that back then during the Great Recession, we lost roughly 1.3 million jobs, and it took us a year and a half to do so. So, and except that this loss was much deeper and much faster within a month. Now, the one thing I have to say is this data is actually not complete. The actual numbers that are going to come up next month are going to be even worse, because this survey ends in the third week of April, and we've lost more jobs since then. Labor force, same thing. 900,000 people dropped out of labor force in California now. Only 770 back then in the Great Recession. Same numbers for Orange County. We lost 264,000 jobs right now. So far, it's not over yet. We only lost 191 for 1.5 years during the Great Recession. And we have a decline in labor force here as well. 94,000 now. 94,000 people have left the labor force, as opposed to 88,000 back in 2009, 2010. Same numbers go there for Los Angeles. And here we have Inland Empire numbers. So Inland Empire has done slightly better. So far, they've lost roughly the same number of jobs that during the Great Recession. And their labor force decline is not as big as before. Now, since I mentioned that some of this data is actually lagging, we did do a quick forecast as to how bad this market will get if you look at it from a sectoral perspective. Now, so far, the data shows that 44% of leisure and hospitality jobs are gone in Orange County. Other services, the job losses are 36%. Retail trade is 19%, and here are the rest of the sector. So of course, leisure and hospitality has completely been decimated. However, we think this doesn't fully reflect the pain. And we did some calculation, which I'm going to show here next. So if you look at it, so leisure and hospitality translated in the number of jobs, we lost 100,000 jobs so far already. That's the latest report that came out last Friday. However, we think that another 27,000 will come in the offings during the month of May. So this will combine for 127,000 jobs lost in this sector alone. Professional services, 42,000 jobs are lost. We expect another about 9,000 for a total of 51. Retail trade, 28,000. Again, we expect another 10,000, so total jobs lost will be about 38,000. And here are the rest of the sectors. So if you put it in totality, we do expect the total estimated job losses for Orange County to come to about 340,000 when this is all said and done. So very grim numbers going forward. Now, I mentioned earlier that payroll data is a bit lagging, but the best thing to look at in this case will be the unemployment claims. And if you look at unemployment claims, I mean, California, 4.2 million people have filed unemployment claims in California. It was really high. 1 million were filing unemployment claims at the end of March. That number has come down to about 240,000 now, but it's still a staggering number. Now, if you look at the share of continuing claims, these are the people that are continuing to draw on unemployment insurance, this is also very high, historically high levels. We're now at about 20%. 20% of covered employees are drawing continual unemployment insurance. So this is, these numbers are really grim. Same grim numbers you can see in the local markets here. Unemployment claims, if you look at Orange County, unemployment claims as of April make up about 14% of the labor force. About same number, roughly the same number is true for LA, same for Riverside, and 12.2%, a little less for San Bernardino. And again, these are staggering numbers that we've never seen before. Now, of course, business sentiment has soured completely. In fact, we have a proprietary indicator that we put together at the center, where we ask a number of Orange County's business CEOs to give us their opinion about how they feel about the local economy and their own businesses. And if you look at the graph here, notice the sharp drop. And the data here, these are the latest data that we collected as of the end of March. So it's a huge drop in business sentiment. This is as bad as we saw during the Great Recession. And of course, this has been a great predictor for employment, so we're not surprised that employment changes kind of tracks this number very well, and employment fell by 15% so far in April. Now, if you look at it a little bit closer to the granular look of the indicators themselves, of this report, we asked questions about, we asked business owners about their prediction for profits and sales and so on. And it's interesting that sentiment has done a complete 180 between first quarter and second quarter of the year. So if you look, for example, at business profits, in first quarter, 60% of businesses felt that they saw an increase in profits over the next 12 months. Now, 77% are telling us the opposite. Basically, they're expecting a decrease in profits. Same goes in sales. 68% expected an increase in sales back in first quarter. Now, 72% do expect a decrease. Same story for hiring. 42% were planning to hire more people. Now 50% are planning to cut their payrolls. So this is a complete 180, so it's not a surprise given how hard this crisis has hit the region. Looking a little bit at home prices here. Home prices were doing good. Actually, the housing market was coming back. If you look at home price growth, Orange County prices sort of only grew by 3% last year, but they averaged about 8% growth in the first 3 months of the year, which was very good. However, that pace has kind of come back a little bit. April data show 4.4% increase. Not catastrophic. Obviously, we see a little bit of deceleration in the growth. And this is a story that you see throughout all the counties. So this is LA, which was growing by 9% the first 3 months of the year. Now a bit of a step back at 2.8%. And you have the rest of the counties here as well. Riverside seemed to have bucked the trend a little bit because they see an increase in April. So the crisis has not quite hit the housing market, at least not home prices yet. We do expect a little bit of step back, but nothing too earth-shattering, probably 5 to 6% drop from the peak for the rest of the year. But certainly housing market should be fairly insulated in Orange County in particular because the housing supply is severely constrained, which would put a floor in home prices, right? A specific floor in home prices. Now, home sales, on the other hand, completely different story. Home sales have absolutely cratered, fell by 30% in Orange County, fell by the same amount, a bit more in LA, by 37%. Same story for Riverside. San Bernardino a little bit better, but certainly COVID-19 has completely decimated home sales. We do expect a pickup. There's no doubt about it. We do think the third quarter is going to be fantastic. There's a lot of pent-up demand out there. So we expect these numbers to actually come back around for the rest of the year. Now, here is our unemployment forecast for Orange County here. We do think that unemployment will peak in the second quarter at 12.1% and kind of decline, but still remain elevated by the end of 2021. Unemployment rate for 2020, 8.2%, the average rate, and next year about 6%. So some tough times ahead, but I want you guys to all remember, just like the words of Terminator, we will be back. And hopefully we'll emerge from this with as sooner as possible, with as few wounds as possible. So where does this leave us? First of all, I thank you for not shooting me. And second, let me just say, since I started with Forrest Gump, let me end with Forrest Gump and say miracles do happen every day. We need a miracle. We need a medical miracle right now. I hope we'll get one. We'll pray for one. And with that, I thank you for being here virtually. I understand we have some words from our sponsors, and we'll be back with Q&A. Thank you.
From the desert to the diamond, from the studio to the stage, a Titan education is defined by immersive experiences, research, internships, study abroad. These high-impact experiences yield high-impact people. Cal State Fullerton. Titans reach higher.
Wow, what a terrific presentation. I just have to say, isn't it great to be out again?
Oh boy, yes.
Just to be here in the studio.
I insisted on coming in the studio exactly for this. I'd missed going out.
So thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you, Paul.
And I have to suggest to myself even that it must be hard to take a presentation like that in this kind of environment, and you must be updating it every 3 seconds.
I was. In fact, we updated in the studio this morning.
I know. Well, thank you very much. We've had some questions come in from our audience.
Excellent.
And so I'd like to get started with some of those questions. And one of the first questions is, before all this happened, we were looking at labor shortages. Now we've lost jobs. So will this end up balancing out?
No, that's a fantastic question. I know, what a problem to have, right? We were, just 3 months ago, we were worried about labor shortages, and the biggest problem that businesses were telling us they were having is filling out those open slots. No, I think the job losses that we've seen are horrendous. Now, again, I make the argument that some of this are completely temporary. They're going to come back. A lot of them are going to come back. But some will not, as you can see from our forecast. So yes, some of those labor shortage problems will be solved in the short term. But I think this sounds like a very difficult. It sounds like a horrendous way to fix a problem that was actually a preferred problem.
So with that in mind, what jobs will come back the strongest? I think you leaned into that a little bit earlier.
Right. That's a fantastic question. So obviously, we do expect, so I mentioned earlier, a lot of these jobs are actually temporary jobs, temporary layoffs, right? And I give the best example I can give with healthcare sector. Healthcare sector, we've seen a lot of layoffs, especially in the offices of dentists, or even private medical offices and so on. So these are the first to come back. So healthcare, I'm not that concerned about. Education is also partially going to be okay, partially because the federal government has actually appropriated some money, and I believe they're going to come back as well. So healthcare is number one. Another sector that I think will be pretty safe to come back is manufacturing. Manufacturing jobs. We lost manufacturing jobs not as fast as we've seen in the Great Recession or so. So that's another sector we see. Construction is a third sector that I do foresee, especially in Orange County, coming back pretty vigorously. partially because construction crews are actually used to interruption to their process. So they can pick up exactly where they left off, assuming the funding hasn't dried up. And some of the funding is long-term. So we do expect those jobs to come back pretty vigorously. The rest of the sectors, of course, you can guess, accommodation and food, leisure and hospitality, they will be the last, unfortunately, to come back. And those are the jobs that have been decimated the most. Those are the sectors that have bared the brunt of these, and the pain of this recession.
Well, a lot of jobs lost for sure. And this also means for a lot of people, they're going to be looking at their retirement.
Yes.
What does this mean regarding people's retirements?
Well, well, luckily the stock market seems to be oblivious to all the bad news. It's been actually, it dropped by 30, it was the fastest drop in history, well, other than October '87, but it was it dropped by 35% in a span of 2.5 weeks, but it's picked up since then. We're not back to normal yet. So one of the big concerns, especially for baby boomers, is the performance of the stock market, because they've tied up a lot of their wealth in retirement income. Thankfully, that's doing okay. My concern is that the market is getting a little bit ahead of itself, partially because some of the data will probably not be or the recovery will not be as strong as they're expecting. Third quarter will be fantastic, but the worry is later on, right, beyond that. So this leads me to my second point, that if the retirement accounts are not where they were pre-crisis, and there's going to be some more pain in the stock market, then people are going to stay longer in their jobs, right? I'm fully prepared to teach my students till I'm 80. I've said it many times, and as long as I keep my job, I will keep doing it.
Just keep working, right?
Keep working.
Keep working.
Keep working.
Well, you know, there's this volatility that we all have kind of almost begun to get used to in a way.
Right.
Is there a chance, though, that we see some normalization in the market in the next year or two? Where do we go with this market?
Yeah, good question. No. I mean, the short answer is no. Part of the reason is because, again, you see this, the market is primarily driven by news, and there's a reason for it, right? The reason is that this is not a normal recession, or this is not a normal recovery, right? It was sort of a mandated recession. It was an ordered recession, right? We shut down the globe, which created a supply shock and then a demand shock. And if that's the case, then obviously the news are going to be what's going to drive the market. You hear news about a vaccine, a therapeutic drug, market moves up. You see bad news about the economy next day, or perhaps a step back in the medical field, and you see the market going down. And I believe this is the volatility will be the theme of this year for sure. In fact, if you find a way to make money on volatility, some people do, that's a great way to do so. But I feel that we're going to be with us for a while. Another concern is, of course, are we going to have a second wave of the virus, right? That would spook even more fear and so on. So again, the market will be beholden to news rather than fundamentals for quite a while.
So we're opening up a little bit, and we're feeling it. What advice do you have for consumers as we reopen?
Go out there and spend. If you can do it, keep it up. Well, the country needs you. The economy needs you. Look, there's one thing that I wanted to, and there's not enough time to get through all the questions in a short presentation, but one thing that is important to remember is, and it's a good news, is that the U.S. consumer was in a fantastic shape prior to the crisis. We paid out a lot of debt. You know, the debt levels were the lowest level we've ever seen in years. In 40 years. Household debt obligations are the lowest we've seen since the 1980s. So what this pandemic did, and I guess the unintended side effect, is that U.S. consumers saved in massive amounts. Saving rate is like 14% now. We haven't seen this number since 1976. So it is a huge, so now that there is all this forced saving, if you will, I did a lot of forced saving, unfortunately. I mean, it's good, it feels a bit better now, but again, it was very painful. But a lot of this forced saving will actually propel a lot of pent-up demand. That's why we do see the third quarter being absolutely fantastic. So I do expect consumers to come back. Now, of course, those who have lost jobs permanently, that's where the problem is. And remember, I mentioned in my presentation, there's an income hole still, and these are mostly for those people who are not going to be made whole even after this crisis is over. And that's where our concern is. That's why we don't think we're going to be back to normal as a V-shaped recovery, but a bit more of a W.
So behaviors could change. We'll just have to see where it goes. One of the questions is leaning into something you said in your presentation about the East and the West Coast receiving less
Right.
PPP. Why would you say that is? Why did that happen?
So it's a very interesting, so there's a cross variation. It's a very interesting question. I don't have a good answer to that. I do know that the first tranche of, we did the same analysis with the first tranche of PPP. It was much worse for California. We were down at only 10% of payroll, so which was really bad. Now the second tranche made it up. So second tranche, a lot more money came to California, but it could be a variety of reasons. A lot of loans haven't been approved. Some of them may have not been approved yet. We don't have all the numbers. And some of it could be that simply the California businesses either are not being approved in massive numbers, and maybe some, whereas other states, especially the South, as I mentioned, are. Now, if you look at overall fiscal support, and that's another interesting analysis we ran. So if you look at overall fiscal support from the $3 trillion that we've spent, California does pretty well. So per capita spending is in California is sort of like in the second tier of states. The first tier is usually the Northern Plains, do much better, but California is in the second tier of that. So we're doing okay in the overall support, not just, but not so much in the PPP money that is coming towards us.
So we're going to begin to wrap up. I hate to do this because this has been a lot of fun to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's been
But
fun.
any final thoughts? And as you come to that, you know, we have the CARES Act,
Yeah.
we have the HEROES Act. What's the final act going to be? This has become a three-part play.
The America Act. I say, my advice is, I guess if I had a parting words of wisdom, tune out the noise. I don't understand why this is political. I don't understand why anything is political, the shutdown or the masks or anything else. Tune out the noise, please. And the final thing I would say is I'd go with what Warren Buffett said, never bet against America. We'll be back.
That's so awesome. Thank you so much. On
Thank you,
behalf
Paul.
of Cal State Fullerton's Woods Center, we are truly grateful for your service to the community. Now, as I turn my attention to the audience, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a great program, The Future of the Economy Part 2. You can replay today's program on YouTube. Let's just say, and Mira, I'm sure you'll join me in this, let's just say OC is open for business. Everyone go have a great OC day. Thank you.
Absolutely.